Centering justice. Rod Wallace. We amplify. Check it. As we open up our minds, we speak into existence. This world where we can manifest peace and deliverance, resistance, strategy, self in the family, blocks and communities, change the world gradually. Let's make a place where the currency is grace and the word is pace. There's many urgencies to face. Process and policy, we here to solve the riddle, cause freedom and equality need justice in the middle. Yeah, we center justice, we center justice to give the youth the chance to live with substance. Yeah, here we go, we here to grow, let them know, we center justice, we center justice. You don't need much to give with abundance. I believe, true indeed, we plant to see, yeah. We center justice, we center justice to give the youth the chance to live with substance. Yeah, here we go, we here to grow, we let them know, we center justice, we center justice. You don't need much to give with abundance. I believe, true indeed, we plant to see, yeah.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to Centering Justice. We're so glad that you're here with us. My name is Hamida Bagarathi, and pronouns she, her, hers, and I have the joy of leading out learning communities at NU. And really excited for the return of this season of Centering Justice. And you just heard the debut of the musical stylings of Rod Wallace from Amplify. We have an intro, y'all. We're super real. So really excited that Centering Justice has grown and expanded and bloomed since its inception a little over 3 years ago. So really glad you're with us. Really, Centering Justice is a place for us to hear about thinkers, movers, speakers, folks who are dreaming of new futures and thinking of futures in different ways towards transformation, particularly focused on racial collaboration. So joining us today are my co-conspirators, Yurdit Mespin-Johnson and Carly Frederick. And we have some special speaker collaborators today, Washington historian Ms. Bev Willis and Black food historian and author Adrian Miller. Thrilled to have both of you with us today. I join you today from Ypsilanti. Welcome to my apartment on the unceded and occupied lands of the 3 council fires of Michigan, Sauk, Fox, and Wyandotte, and land in which contemporary Indigenous peoples continue to live and thrive and contribute to their and our collective uplift. And I name that to acknowledge, but there's still the outstanding question of what to do with that. And our hope is that in reflection of histories, communities, moving transformation, that we think about, so who came before us? I mean, I might think about who ate this curry that I might make before me, and what, I live in Michigan, what might be different about that? So today, really, this is a place for us to think about our histories, including food histories, and how they are so interconnected across places, generations, people that we may or may not know, and flavors. And one thing that came up is at times there can be an illusion that something is authentic, or what it means to, I'm reading this book called The Inner Work, and it talks about mindness, or the desire to lay claim to something and claim that that is belonging to someone. And I was like, oh, I have felt that at times, but really interrogating, what does that mean? And I mentioned curry earlier. I think about curry and it's like rich, pun intended, history, where, I mean, it's traveled all across Southeast Asia, many other places. I'm from Trinidad, and so there's a deep West Indian contingency that makes curry, but also the British claims it as its own as well, right? And so there's some conflict there, or there can be conflict there, as to who owns it, who has a right to really engage with something, and what does it mean if something is a part of our lives, but it might be unexpectedly a part of our lives? How do we acknowledge that? And can something still be authentic or real? And all of you probably saw our description, so I'll just share it out to refresh us. Food ties us together and is intimately connected to our histories and senses of identity. Not only does food sustain us, we build community over food. Culturally, food holds immense meaning. With Adrian Miller, we'll reflect on the history of African American food and how it's changed over time. And we'll be joined by Bev Willis, who can share local history and insights about Black food and entrepreneurs, and also culture and ways of being and ways of living. Knowing we're in a new season, I think the last time we were online was in May, and I think about how many lives, like probably all of us have lived in that time. What inspired this direction for this season of CJ? So I'll shimmy things over onto Yodit so she can share some of her insights.
Thanks, H. You got me thinking about curry now, lady. It's lunchtime. It's so good to be with y'all, and I hope folks had a good summer. I am just a couple weeks back from a beautiful sabbatical, a couple months off to travel, actually not far from Trinidad, Hamida, to engage with the diasporic food system across this country. And I'm coming back here excited and on the heels of a dinner last week at the Zingerman's Roadhouse in Ann Arbor. Our friends over there hosted a fundraiser on our behalf to help us raise money for the transformation of our physical space in Ann Arbor. I'm so grateful. We had a funky good time, you hear me? And the special guest speaker was Adrian Miller. So Adrian, thank you for being here. And for those of you who are new to Centering Justice, I do see some familiar folks in our live audience. At its roots, Centering Justice is about stories and storytellers. Here, I'm leaning on the West African traditions of the griot, whose role has traditionally been to preserve the genealogies, historical narratives, and oral traditions of their people. And for me, as many of you know, this platform was about amplifying and uplifting not just West African or Black histories and stories, but the stories of melanated folk from all over our community and all over our country. And what are stories but immersive experiences that help to constitute core ideas of larger narratives? When they're personal, broader, and deeper, they really do help narrative come to life and make it relatable and accessible. And this year on Centering Justice, this season rather, we're learning our way through some concepts that extend beyond storytelling. I'm aware that we are beginning as an organization to have some positional influence, and I feel responsible to use that influence to inform our work, the organizations we work with, and broadly society, and to help contribute to new narratives that lead to true justice, equity, and the aspirations of our democracy, which I worry every day are being threatened. And so there's story, and then there's narrative, and narrative is really the collection or system of related stories that are articulated and refined over time, and that represent a core idea or belief. And unlike in our individual stories, y'all, narratives have no standard form or structure. They don't have a beginning or an end, so to speak. They infuse our individual stories, and they help with deeper meaning by connecting those together. And we are all navigating dominant narratives that define and reinforce social norms. They tell us who is us. They tell us who is them. They tell us what's true and what's false, what's proper and improper, what can and cannot be done or undone. And whether they are dominant or alternative, they can and do produce and reproduce injustice and inequity. They also have the possibility to create more equity, more justice, and more freedom for all of us. And so then there's counter narrative, which is ultimately what we're up to here at Centering Justice. And those are derived from the most marginalized individuals and communities. And these narratives use their insight, their wisdom, our knowledge, our wisdom, our know-how to build a vision of a more inclusive society and to reimagine and expand the dimensions of what would be considered normal or acceptable. And so in this way, here we are replacing dominant narratives with diverse and inclusive stories. And when we do that, we build narrative power that necessitates that we not only center folks who have the closest proximity to oppression, but that we also work towards models whereby those who are impacted not only tell the stories, but take part in leading, identifying solutions, and setting the priorities, policy agendas, and shifting those narratives about human value. And so that is what news work beyond centering justice is to center those communities and to disrupt existing narratives. And one of the things we have to remember is that stories are never told separate from larger power structures, right? The narrative is really a key element of the mode of production in which these elements that we're talking about really function. And so one thing that we can and are beginning to do here at New is to think about building narrative power and to consider what stories have been left off the table. So as I told you, this month I returned from a 2-month sabbatical that was intended to sort of pressure test our succession plan. I'm grateful to the McGregor Fund that funded this, but in practice, it was really a chance for us to disrupt the single narrative that this organization could not operate if I wasn't here. We don't believe that's the case, and we really are rebuffing the idea of the single charismatic leader. We know that there are new narratives to develop about how we work together, how we share and distribute leadership and power. And on a larger scale, we're working alongside many people and organizations whose missions are addressing the deplorable downstream conditions of poverty, racism, and trauma. And bear with me here, y'all, because I think this is just important for kicking off this season together, but it's really important for me that you understand that it is that's at the root of why I want to remodel our physical space in Ann Arbor. It's a project that has very little to do with the bricks and mortars and more about getting folks more proximate to the root causes of poverty and trauma locally, which include the gentrification of the neighborhood that our building and our work is in. And it is these conditions in our neighborhood are a result of systemic de facto segregation practices that were and continue to be born of stories and narrative about who belongs in Ann Arbor and who doesn't, who belongs in Washtenaw County and who doesn't. We will not have the power to change the rules that create poverty and sustain corporate control over our lives unless we build the power to reshape the popular mental model that governs how people think poverty works. Poverty is not the result of bad decisions. It is because of poverty that people are forced into making impossible and harmful decisions. In the popular imagination, poverty is the product of these bad personal decisions, not bad collective decisions. So therefore, many people believe that poverty is unfortunate, which frankly creates no dissonance, without believing that it's unjust, which would create dissonance and yield to intolerance and a need to find the resolution. It is only by believing that poverty is unjust and that a just system would be good for everybody that people are going to consent to change. But we haven't developed a coherent narrative about poverty's injustice that is motivating, nor a set of experiences that would be anywhere near compelling enough for people to internalize a new narrative and a mental model embedded in it. That is to say, we have not invested in the right narrative infrastructure, nor have we developed the narrative itself for moving away from this powerful. And so we're using our positional power today, all year long, every day, all day, to illuminate counter narratives about why this neighborhood looks the way it does and why it's so very different from what it looked like just 40 years ago. And so I want to round out with just one more story that hopefully resonates with others. And I want to name that someone recently brought to our attention that we haven't really been explicit about support and alliance and solidarity with the LGBTQIA community. And I want to be clear that there are many people who are guests on our show, and there are also many people among our team who have many identities, not just a single identity. And while we have never thought it our place to call that out, and in this case, the two co-hosts have cisgendered identities, we also love and extend this platform to folks in that community. But let me tell you a little story about why that really resonates. Narrative power is not merely the presence of the issue or issue frames on the front page. It's the ability to make that presence powerful, the presence of a counter narrative, to be able to achieve presence in a way that forces change in the status quo in real, material, and value-added terms. Therefore, our work in narrative strategy has to go beyond empathy, whether we're talking about poverty, whether we're talking about people's full humanity or their sexual or gender identities. Empathy alone is just not enough. We have incorrectly assumed that the strategy behind the success of marriage equality was about empathy. It wasn't. Winning by focusing on a shared value of love and not maintaining a parallel focus on power. Focusing on increasing empathy and dignity for oppressed people was not enough to change the rules. When we were able to engender empathy among large swaths of straight people like me for gay and lesbian people who couldn't visit their partners, folks felt bad. They felt like that was unfortunate. They wanted people to have access by granting civil unions, but they wouldn't think to go any further than that. So let's be clear. That's as far as empathy got us, seeing some LGBTQI people's situation as unfortunate, but not as unjust, and wanting to solve a specific technical problem rather than the systems writ large in order to create justice. It did not make us want LGBT people overall to be powerful. It did not make us want to change the status quo of them overall in society, let alone trans people, let alone Black trans people. It did not defeat the norms institutionalized by religion, culture, community, and family, and the infrastructure of the right-wing TV, radio networks that are also tied to mega church broadcasts. All these ideas that had great power and could not be overcome by a shift in emotion alone. To get to marriage equality, and by that, I mean organizers, cultural strategies, and folks like Rashad Robinson, an expert in narrative and cultural strategy, they had to focus on shifting power dynamics, not just emotional dynamics. So as I wrap up, when we talk about increasing representation, which is one of our aims, who the spokespeople are and why that matters, it's because stories do actually help us to see. And by see, I mean perceive of, understand, and be immersed in a different way of living. And non-homogeneously, because history books, the media, and those others often tell us very narrow stories. What we have now is huge attacks on banned books, on critical race theory, and even on local mythologies, like the one that Ann Arbor and Washtenaw are progressive and liberal places. So why wouldn't anybody want to know more about widening conclusions? Why wouldn't we want those whose experiences and stories that have fomented our democracy uplifted? Well, that's because if you write the story, if the winners get to write the story, then they get to uphold the power that currently exists. So Yodi, how does all of this matter about forgotten recipes and about today's guest? Well, Adrian and his widely acclaimed book, Black Smoke, help us to broaden our understanding of food and culture and the origins of barbecue. All of this is essential to help us change our perceptions of what divides us interculturally and intraculturally. And Bev's presence today, it'll help us to illuminate local Black foodways, entrepreneurial histories, and expand our views of who belongs here locally and who doesn't. And finally, I would say that when I met Adrian, he mentioned something about the history of barbecue that blew my damn mind and also caused me to challenge some of my own stories and internalized narratives. So y'all, I want to thank you for listening, but I also want to prepare you for the Soul Food Scholar and for Bev to drop some knowledge on you today that might be as scrumptious as the hot biscuits we had last week. Thanks again to our friends at Zingerman's, and thanks Adrian and Bev for being here.
No, thank you. It's so wonderful being in this space with you all.
Thank you so much for joining us. So I'm not going to spend more time, partially because my mouth is watering thinking of biscuits. So for those of you who have joined Centering Justice before, we always ask folks who are spending time with us, what are some identities that you hold that you're bringing with you into this space? What are some of the communities that you've drawn upon, leaned on, have helped shaped you? If you could share those with us. And for this episode, what like family stories or histories or relationships to food and culture really inform who you are? We'd love to dig into that. Miss Bev Willis, if you could share first, that would be incredible. And then Adrian.
Oh, wonderful. It's so good to be here with you all this afternoon. I really appreciate this treasured time together. The word identity really resonated me for a while because I am a middle daughter who has always felt most comfortable in the aquatic, nebulous environment of being a Pisces in this world. For me, identity has always been a shared and occupied space by the seen and unseen, unknown familiars, those who came before me, those who are with me, maybe physically present, maybe not, and those who will come after I am here. So my experience of who I am in this world is super connected to all those who are here with me. I am the daughter of 2 journalists. I am the granddaughter of entrepreneurs, writers, porters, and homemakers. And I am the great-granddaughter of food entrepreneurs and farmers, and the great-great-great-granddaughter of the children of formerly enslaved ancestors from North Carolina and Alabama. Some of their words I hope to share with you today, because my family is a family of writers and keepers of records. But growing up in Washington, D.C., our backyard was essentially the 23 Smithsonian museums and all of the monuments and all of the national parks. History was ever present in every form, in every community. Washington was an international city with a huge chocolate base. I had no issues about my identity as an African American, as an American, as a young girl. And as a young girl in Washington, D.C., I knew who was responsible for the layout of our city. Sure, Pierre L'Enfant got the credit, but we know it was Benjamin Banneker who had the vision to make that city come to life. And we know that it was actually Thomas Jefferson who recommended that Benjamin Banneker be placed on the planning committee. And we know that he was the first Black architect hired by the city of Washington, D.C. And we also know that one of the reasons why it mattered that he was involved is because the original designer ran off with the plans. And Benjamin Banneker was able to recreate those plans, mostly from memory, in a couple of days. And we also know that for 10 years, he published the annual Farmer's Almanac. Now, I know these things not because we studied or taught Black history growing up in Washington, D.C., but because my family made sure that we learned as much as possible about who we were and who we came from in every shade and form and fashion. So identity for me is such a huge word because it encompasses so much. So today, I'm looking forward to hearing more from not only Adrian, but also from some of our participants as we share these beautiful stories about food and culture and how it makes us who we are.
Wonderful to hear. Yeah, so when I often give a speech about food, I often start with this. I'm going to admit something that's going to immediately lose me all street cred on the subject of soul food and barbecue. I am an African American man born and raised in Denver, Colorado, and its environs. So wait, let me win you back. So I'm the son of two Southerners. My mom, Johnetta Miller, was from Chattanooga, Tennessee. My dad is Hyman Miller Sr. is from Helena, Arkansas. They separately came to Denver in the 1960s and they met in church, the church that I still go to, Campbell Chapel African Methodist Episcopal Church. So I definitely consider myself a man of faith, and my day job is I run the Colorado Council of Churches. So even though I'm a lay person, I consider myself a faith leader. So was just very intellectual from an early age. So I embrace the term blurred. If you've never heard that, it's Black nerd, and I embrace it. I don't run from it. I'm a recovering attorney. I practiced law for a few years, didn't really enjoy that. I also was in politics for a long time. So I worked in the Clinton White House on something called the Initiative for One America, which was a racial reconciliation effort. I also worked at a think tank in Colorado called the Bell Policy Center, which really was looking out for people who were sitting on the margins of society. Like, how do we move people who are often left out of policymaking decisions and the benefits of society? How do we get them to a place of self-sufficiency? And then I worked for Colorado's governor. But I've had this side hustle that is emerging as a main hustle where I am a person who writes stories about African American food traditions. And it was really because I read a book on Southern food written by a guy named John Edgerton, Southern Food at Home, on the Road in History. He's a white Southerner. He wrote a book in the late 80s about the history of Southern food. And early in that book, he wrote this one sentence that changed my life. The tribute to Black achievement in American cookery has yet to be written. I thought that was really interesting. So I tracked him down and I just asked him, you know, you wrote this 14 years ago. I'm reading the book in 2001. Do you think this is still true? And he said, you know, people have addressed parts of the story, but no one's taken on the full story. There's always room for another voice, so why not yours? So with no qualifications at all, except for eating a lot of soul food and cooking it some, that's what started me on the journey. So I'm an author. I've written a book on the history of soul food, the history of Black chefs in the White House, also history on African American barbecue. Thank you, Bev, for the decoration, the shout out behind you. I love it. And I'm just looking forward to telling more stories about African American food history and just celebrating these cooks and the culture as well as the cuisine.
I love that. I love that. Adrian and Bev, at Centering Justice, we're often holding this tension between change and transformation. And the irony of that is that while I was on sabbatical, I got Octavia Butler's quote about change tattooed on my body. But I'm really most interested as a racial and economic justice advocate and practitioner in transformation. And I believe transformation, for me at least, is something that emerges from within and then reverberates out. So I'm curious about your own stories of transformation, recognizing that it's dynamic, it's not a destination, but a journey. And I wonder if you might share with our audience, as they contemplate their own transformation, a moment where you knew your ways of being or your working had been or were transforming. And maybe you could share a story that really relates to our discussion today.
You want to go ahead, Bev?
You go first.
Okay. Well, I'm going to cheat and tell two stories, but I won't make them long. So forgive
me. You're here for all of it.
Okay. So one thing is, all my life I've been interested in racial justice and So I just thought deeply about race. And I was at a point in my life, and this was in my early 20s. I like, well, why do white people not get this? Why do we always have to educate them on just like obvious stuff? And then I was having a conversation with a colleague of mine who's a woman. And I just asked her, hey, what are you going to do when you get home? Excuse me. And she said, oh, well, when I get home, I just check every room in my apartment, make sure that no one's there. And then I just go ahead and I'll just probably just watch some TV. And that was the first time that I thought about my own male privilege, because at that time of my life, when I go home, actually still today, when I go home, I just plop on the couch and turn on the TV. I feel secure. So I think of myself as a good guy, an enlightened guy. So I thought, well, look, if I'm not even thinking about what women go through day in and day out, that made me think about race. Because I just think a lot of white people are not in situations where they have to think about race. So unless something triggers that or prompts them, they're not going to think about these issues. So it really deepened my approach when it came to talking about race and pushing for racial justice. The other one was when I made this transformation to becoming an author. I'm a very risk averse person. Most of my life, I thought I'm going to practice law and then I'm going to transition to politics. I'm eventually going to be the U.S. Senator from Colorado. I wanted to be the president for a long time, but then I learned more and I'm like, nah, I don't think I want to do that. So I thought I would be the U.S. Senator. And then, this thing kept calling to my soul for that one sentence that I read in the book. And so when I finally made the decision to write about the history of soul food, several people, mainly African Americans, just said to me, why are you going to write about that? That is the food that the master didn't want. That's the food that white people throw in the garbage. Why are you celebrating and literally digesting white supremacy? Other people said, and you went to Stanford University. You're going to spend your intellectual energy on soul food? What is going on with that? And then from people outside the culture, it's like, why would you talk about that? I mean, that's not worthy of celebration or even comment. And so when I brought the idea to publishers to write this book, they're like, oh, that's interesting, but nobody's going to read this. Or they would say, there's already a book in the market. Now, mind you, there was plenty of soul food cookbooks in the market, but there was never a serious scholarly treatment of soul food. It did not exist. But because there was one soul food book in the market 20 years ago, there was no room for my book. So that made me more entrepreneurial and encouraged me to really seek out, find these stories and sort out fact from fiction.
Wow. I love that. When I think of transformation moments for me, my first one actually occurred in the first grade. I always struggled with school. My older sister was brilliant. As a middle child, I thought, that's great. That means the heavy lifting has been done. Teachers would bargain with me to try to do my best, send letters home to my parents. We know she can do better. By the time I was in the second grade, I says, okay, I'm going to try this. And I had a wonderful teacher, and we learned in science about the miracle of molecules. And the teacher had a wonderful time telling us how the chair we were sitting in really wasn't solid. It was a mass of moving molecules. And I remember coming home and telling my parents that. And I can remember the look on their face thinking, oh my goodness, a little knowledge is so dangerous. Because from that moment on, I said that if scientific fact like this can be true, that's all I needed to know. The world is in a constant state of motion and transformation, my kind of rhythm. It came from a reliable source. And if that fact is true, then anything can be true. We have the capacity to create our own ways of being. We can choose self-direction and adjustment. We can choose to learn the math and leave the science alone or vice versa. So once I learned that, I felt like I had a greater understanding of the control that I had over my own ability to have my best life. It took years of practice, and I'm still practicing that, but it has definitely was one of my first moments of transformation. But the one that really stands out in my mind after that happened when I was in mid-20s, and I was able to read my grandmother's journals. Now, my own mother never read these books. And out of all of the journals that my grandmother wrote, Willa Carter Ransom, she kept only 2, and she burned the rest. My mother never read the ones, but she saved them for us. And she also saved several of the writings that my grandmother had about being the wife of an NAACP attorney who became the acting dean of Howard University Law School in Washington, D.C., and struggled with all of the things that a position like that brings, the racism, the hatred, the fear. And as an NAACP attorney, he was a staunch defender of some of our poorest members of our race in their fight for legal rights and access. She also wrote about the memories of her own mother, who was born free, but her grandmother, who was born enslaved. And when I read those words, it truly changed my way of being. My mom told me that when I was born, my grandmother held me, practically took her from me, and said, "She's mine. She looks like me." I was, I do, and I am hers. So those are the type of things when I think about what changes us, and change is constant. It happens all the time, within and without. Having the confidence and the security that family and love, important recipes, food that gave us warmth and comfort, these are the elements to propel us into our adult life and make it easier for us to have the best life that we can. And those are the moments of transformation. They continually come. Soon after losing my mom in 2020, I got a box of Bisquick. I was compelled to buy it in the grocery store. It was the foundation of many of our meals: biscuits, shortbread, strawberry shortcake. It was just one of those staples. Or a box of Dream Whip. And I got that. And I can still imagine the aluminum metal bowl in the freezer with the beaters getting ice cold, so that when that milk and that magic powder got poured together and whipped up, we had that topping for that pumpkin pie or that dessert that my mom had made. So food, the comfort and the security and the love and the joy that it brings to people of all cultures and all beings, is at the heart and essence of the strength and foundation of who we are. So it lives warmly within me. And those are some of the things that just transformed me and continue to do so.
Oh, Bev, you just wax poetic. And I know it's because you're a fellow Pisces. You know. I was really thinking about some things that Hamida shared as we were preparing for the episode. And I wonder, Hamida, if you might just chat a little bit about your own relationship to culture and to food.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for that invitation, Yodit. And it's really complicated. And I feel, in terms of my own self-development work, how I'll use I statements here, giving myself to grow and shift from what I believe others thought I could be has been incredibly freeing and terrifying, because I don't have a rubric anymore. It's not like I have this checklist of ways to be. And I think about, Adrian, when you were talking about like what it means to engage white folks in this work, and I noted in the chat like some perspective taking and what sounded like empathy, and thinking about, well, maybe folks just didn't think about it. They would be moved if they thought about it. I've been thinking about my own orientation to social justice work, to racial collaboration work. And I think about, what do I give space to? Like, if we're talking about white privilege all the time, I am the one bringing the white narrative into the space, which might latently, quietly exist there, but I'm the one who's spoken into existence. And what responsibility might myself or colleagues or friends or community members who do the same thing, what might we hold? I think in this sort of like dichotomous person of color, white person, racial conflict, I think there's also a lot of nuance. I mentioned curry at the top of our time together. Some of you might know that my mother was Muslim and my father was Hindu. And through the indentured slave trade, my ancestors were transported from India to Trinidad. And I think about how there were millennia-long conflict between Muslims and Hindus. And so what are some dynamics intra-group, within groups of color, that can make things really complicated too? Even if we may eat the same bread, we might not break it together because of who we can consider our own kin and who we have chosen to not consider our own kin. Dawn, I see your note. Absolutely. White narratives are already there, invisible, and I think about what it means if we're offering counter narratives, and that's what I wish to do. That means I got to bring something else to the table. All right. Like I got to bring something else like voice, experiences, and really think about how to build relationships and build relationships genuinely with dialogue and talking about difference and nuances because the conversation is way more complicated than like does the South have a lock on barbecue? Does India have a lock on curry, right? Like, why do we need to have a lock on anything? But like, how do we share and enjoy each other's experiences and cultures and palettes? So, apologies if that was a little disjointed, but in some ways, as listening to Adrian and Bev, like there's so much wrapped into how we approach this work. And I've been in the season of my life of thinking of actually, what is my problem that I thought was not my problem? Oh,
Mm, mm. No, it wasn't disjointed at all. It made a lot of sense to me. And I'm really like you, I have multiple identities, racial and ethnic identities. And one of the identities that's really important to me is, my father is an immigrant from Tigray, Ethiopia. And the first time I went to Ethiopia to visit my family, I stayed with my grandmother who's now 90 years old. And she's a matriarch in our family and in the community, Hamida. But when I arrived, I was quite surprised by the dissonance between her stature and her living conditions.
Mhm.
And while I was visiting, she cooked. There was my grandmother is a Coptic Christian, and it was a holiday, a patron Saint Michael's birthday or celebration day. And so she was cooking, and she wasn't cooking, Hamida, in the kitchen. She was cooking out in the grassy area of the back of her house. And she was cooking in this cauldron. In fact, I'm not even sure the stove worked. And I just remember thinking, wow, this is where the matriarch of my family prepares meals, in this grassy kind of dirt lot with this old cauldron of meat and stew, boiling, right? And she was going to be feeding the whole community, which would be at least 100 people, Hamida, with such in such modest and what we might even call impoverished circumstances. And it made me think, because I grew up primarily as a Black girl on the west side of Detroit. My mother also, modest means a lot of folks around us experiencing what we know to be poverty, right? But I had not seen poverty at that scale than what I saw when I visited parts of Ethiopia. And yet, for the first time, and this is my one of my transforming stories, I saw and witnessed joy at a level I could not even conceive of. You couldn't have told my grandmother she was poor, right? And I'm talking about poor. If you grew up on the west side of Detroit, the Brewster Projects, poor. That was my context for poor. And this was very different from that. But the other thing, when people would ask me about the trip, how was it? The best way I could summarize it for Black people who were asking me is that our story does not begin with pain. And so when Dawn talks about centering white narratives, and when we talk about Blackness, we are often talking about a very narrow definition of Blackness within the context of this country. We're talking about Black people as margins at the margins in this country. But we and other people like you and like Adrian and like Bev and our ancestors comprise the global majority. Every human being is in fact a descendant of our people, right? So I'm really excited to get more into then, well, how then is food a part of that? And I wanna go back over to Adrian and Bev. So look, last week we all met at the Roadhouse for the fundraiser, and Adrian, not only are you like, I'm a blur too. Come on now, blurs unite. You're funny as shit. And I wonder, can you say a little bit more about Black Smoke, this best-selling book you've written, and some of the context? I would love if some of our Centering Justice audience had like a window into some of that talk last week, which was so fire.
Sure. So, I wrote this book, Black Smoke, as a love letter to African American barbecuers. And what I love is that sisters have been grilling it for themselves in a long time in Black food traditions, right? So it's not just dude food. But when you turn on the TV, you read magazines and all this other stuff, you just see white dudes celebrate it. So I wanted to just, delve into this and see where it came from. So, I look back to West African traditions. And the challenge there is that we're dealing with cultures that rely on oral traditions. So there's just not a lot of stuff written down. And when it's written down, it's by people outside the culture. So, how reliable is that narration? But when it comes to barbecue, it seems like the story starts in the Americas. Like the word barbecue, which is a game of historical telephone, really begins with this story. Columbus and his crew arrive in the Caribbean in the 1490s, what we now call the Dominican Republic. And when they approach this island, on the shore, they see a raised platform made out of sticks with a very slow fire underneath it. And there's meat, fish, a funny looking lizard that they really never seen before, and some other stuff over very slow fire. No humans around. So as a sign of things to come, Columbus and his crew just help themselves to all the food that they wanted to eat without asking. The humans show up later. These are the indigenous people in that area, and they're astonished, and there's some conversation. And eventually, the word barbecue comes from barbacoa, which is what the Spanish sailors, because remember, Columbus, though Italian, was sailing with Spanish sailors, thought they heard the indigenous people calling the raised platform of sticks. So the word barbecue comes from Spanish barbacoa, right? So it's just kind of one language removed, I guess. So the word barbecue doesn't get applied to the food or the cooking process until much later. But this word does not exist until Europeans come to the Americas. And then what we understand as barbecue to this day, I locate historically in Virginia. It's essentially a modification of what indigenous people in Virginia were doing that later gets affected by colonizing Europeans and enslaved Africans. Now, this was mind-blowing to me because when I started this book, I wanted to prove definitively that barbecue was from West Africa, go like this and say Wakanda forever. But I'm a dude who follows the facts. And historically speaking, it's fixated in Virginia. In fact, in the early days of barbecue, they would call it Virginia barbecue. Like Virginia and barbecue on the mainland North America, those were synonymous terms. So it upends this narrative that, it was Europeans who started it. They brought the cows and the pigs and all this stuff. Yeah, it was indigenous in its foundation. Now, I got a lot of haterade for that. Several African Americans were like, "You're not a real brother. We can't have anything." And I just said, look, y'all, just because it's Native American in foundation doesn't mean that we can't celebrate this food tradition that we certainly took on another level and then spread around America to become this beloved food. We have a lot of African Americans have Native American ancestry. They know it's part of the bloodlines. So I think it's a wonderful collaboration that existed. And even into the 20th century, you had older African Americans calling barbecue cooking the Indian way. So I just thought that was really interesting. So barbecue existed like this for 200 years. It was digging a trench in the ground, couple feet wide, couple feet deep, filling that with hardwood, chopped up hardwood, setting that aflame until it burned down till it was coals. And then you had to get your animals, kill them, butcher them, and then usually pigs or sheep. Sometimes they did cows, they would quarter them because they're so big. They would butterfly them, so they would spread out the animal after butchering it. And then they would stick poles in the side of the animal. And then it was someone's job to regularly flip those animals over the hardwood burning coals to cook them evenly. Another person had to walk up and down that trench in order to find any cold spots and add fresh coals. And somebody else had a sauce made out of vinegar and spices, and they would just walk along up and down and they would just dab it to keep it moist. So this was hard work. And we have accounts in the early 1800s of barbecues for thousands of people. There's a reason why you don't hear about fish fries or fried chicken dinners for thousands of people, because logistically it would be a nightmare. But as long as you had enough land and enough labor and enough of the food, you could make that happen with barbecue. So that was America's earliest big time public celebration party food. And it was hard work. And the racial dynamic in this country is if y'all got hard work, you make African Americans do it, as enslaved African Americans. So by the time you get to the 1820s, blackness and barbecue are wedded in the public imagination in the United States. In fact, there are newspaper articles about barbecue printed outside the South saying that if you're going to have the real thing, you have an African American do it. So, you know, at the time they would say colored or Negro man, you know, expert artist, whatever, do this work. And so African Americans over time get this very marketable skill. And then after emancipation, they're barbecue ambassadors. They're put on trains, stagecoaches, boats to bring a taste of Southern barbecue to the other locations. And these are reported in newspapers all over the place. And then a lot of times, you know, they're like, hey, this is kind of nice compared to the South. I think I'm just going to stay here. And so they ultimately kickstart the barbecue scenes for a lot of our major cities. So that was barbecue. It really wasn't until the 1890s that you started to see white men get involved in barbecue. And even the most celebrated white men in barbecue had an all black labor force. So they were kind of the front people for barbecue, but African Americans were still doing the work. And this really existed until the 20th century, when barbecue moves from this rural context of whole animal cooking to an urban context where people started saying, okay, well, let's chop these animals up into smaller parts, focuses on that. And then it's a different cooking method, like the charcoal grills and things like that. But even with that change, African Americans still dominated until we get to the 1990s, when barbecue starts to be thought of as craft, and you start to see a lot of white men get into it. And then it becomes something different. And then we start to see the vanishing of African Americans from this, to the point where, excuse me, in 2004, I'm watching the Food Network and I see this commercial for Paula Deen's Southern barbecue. So I thought, you know, I'm writing this book on soul food, but let me watch to see who are the people celebrated and the leading lights in barbecue. 60 minutes later, credits are rolling. Not one African American was featured on this barbecue special about the American South. So the first thing I thought was, well, how does that happen in 2004? That was certainly not my experience. I know how much barbecue African American contributed to barbecue. Then the second thing I thought is, well, maybe I got it twisted. Maybe it was Paula Deen's Scandinavian barbecue, sponsored by Alabama White Sauce. So that led to an investigation, and I saw the same problem endemic in media from all over the place, and that's why I ended up writing Black Smoke.
Okay. First of all, that was like just such a succinct but powerful recap. And I'm actually, I want to turn to a couple of things you uplifted. One, I will count myself among the Black folks that were like, what? We didn't invent barbecue. What the hell is Adrian talking about? Two, it makes me, this last piece that you talked about where Paula Deen and Guy Fieri and these other folks are getting credit for barbecue. It made me think a lot. We're celebrating 50 years of hip hop this year, right? And I feel in many ways the same thing happened with hip hop, which is that, you know, it's very grassroots. It has these Caribbean connections. It grows, and then it is essentially co-opted, right? To the point where I watch Grammys and VMAs and these other award shows, and I'm like, you gave best rap artist to who? I'll never forget. I can't remember what show it was, but like Maroon 5 or somebody won for, you know, so that really resonated deeply with me. Bev, this is wild. There's some local histories that, oh, I'm sorry, let me go back, because there's one other thing that I think is important that you touched on, and that is the 1619 Project, Adrian. Yes. Let's talk a little bit about that and a revelation that you shared this week that I'd never thought about.
Yeah, so one thing, after delving into these food stories and reviving this history that was once vibrant and told, I was wondering, well, you know, why hasn't African American food traditions been celebrated on a global level? Because when you think about it, almost every aspect of our culture has gone global. The way we talk, dance, entertain, play sports, what we wear our hair, everything, right? Except our food. And when our food goes global, it's not attached to our culture. People don't think of it as an African American thing. I was recently in the Middle East. They're grubbing on barbecue and Nashville hot chicken, and they have no idea about the African American influences on those two food traditions. Yes, grubbing on those things. Those things are big in the Middle East. And so I think it's because we don't have a lot of cheerleaders on a global stage that are advocating for our food the way they advocate for other things. And also culturally, I just think we have a shame about our food. There's a wonderful book called Eating While Black by Psyche Williams Forson. I'll put it in the chat, which goes to this. She won a James Beard Award for this book, which talks about the stigma. And just to give all of y'all a data point, 1619 Project, groundbreaking, right? Interesting look at history, celebratory. I mean, all the feels, right? Go back, look at those essays. There is not one thing about food. And so the question is, why is that the case? And I think it's just the lack of boosterism and the lack of and the shame that we feel for these food, because it goes back to what I said earlier. People think African American food is steeped in slavery, poverty, white rejection, when it's much more complex than that.
Mm-hmm.
This whole idea of forgotten recipes, I mean, first of all, you obviously bring us back to this deep indigenous history, to the food and to the culture. But then this shame piece that you talk about, and I wonder how much of narrative and storytelling, Bev, you touched on this a little bit when you were talking about the stories that get told at home versus the stories that get told more broadly. What's coming up for you as you listen to Adrian reflect on his comments and your own?
Mm-hmm. Well, what comes up for me is when the term soul food just started being used, probably in the 60s. But we knew that the style of cooking had been around ever since Africans came to America. Followed by 100 years of segregation and hardship, this food was not only a source of nourishment, but it was truly a tool for our strength and our unity and our resilience. Our ancestors knowing to boil yams were accompanied by cayenne pepper, a food combining source of strength and vitality, was something that they were able to give each other without the owner knowing what was really happening in the kitchen. After the abolishment of slavery, the ingredients, the techniques, all of the associations that we have as a people between our food and our comfort and our identification of our meals, all of that pride, it was just transcended to all succeeding generations. So it holds a central identity. And even as we've advanced and understand that the ingredients themselves are so healthful and contribute to our well-being, our methods of preparation have evolved to match that. When we think about history and talking to people about it, my experience of working at the Washtenaw County Historical Society, at the museum on Main Street, with the African American Cultural and Historical Museum, everybody has a story. Everybody has a story of where they come from and who they are. And one of the things that I first started learning when I was working in local history, I was really intrigued by a term that they used for an area in Ypsilanti called Hungry Hill. It took a while to find out what that meant. Still not completely sure, but thanks to the work of A.P. Marshall, former EMU professor, local historian, did a lot of our historic excavation. He did lots of oral interviews with some early residents, and one of the people that he interviewed was the Mashat family. They came to Ypsilanti in the early 1930s. Back then, they had already, the systems had already moved African Americans out of Depot Town because of the railroad tracks, and the phrase was, they put us on the hill. They used to call it Hungry Hill. It's basically southwest corner of Ypsi, roughly Michigan Avenue, Hamilton, I-94 triangle, but specifically Monroe, Madison, and Jefferson streets. So when Mr. Mashat was giving the interview, he said that when his father went to get a permit to build a house, he took the blueprints down to City Hall. They told him they didn't care what we built on the hill as long as we stayed on the hill. That little piece of knowledge led to some more research and excavating things like stories about Thomas Rodman. He was an African American who was born in bondage in Knoxville, Tennessee in 1844. He came north as a young man to Ypsilanti, joined Company C of the 102nd United States Colored Troop fighting in the Civil War. And many of the activities of that unit during the war were raids on plantations in South Carolina and Florida that liberated hundreds of enslaved African Americans. After the war, he came back to Ypsilanti, and he was a member of a band that would perform traveling circuses. When he was in Ypsilanti, he owned a restaurant, the only Black-owned eating establishment in town that was located at 215 Congress Street. Another person that we learned about during this time was the whole way that the highway system and urban renewal transformed Ypsilanti's African American South Side. There was a thriving Black business district in the Harriet Monroe Street area. So the next time you kind of get off of I-94, coming into Ypsilanti, you can kind of visually imagine what it was like when there was businesses like Bennett's Billiard Hall, Ed Powell's restaurant, Thelma Goodman's beauty supply, the 310 bar, Eva Walls had a diner, the Washington brothers had a cafe, Charles Griffin operated a candy shop. And then in the 70s, there was a restaurant called Granny's. It was next to the Ypsilanti police station. And in the early 70s, Mattie Dorsey, community activist, had a grocery store on Jefferson Avenue and Brook Street. Her store was later the site of the Progressive Cooperative in the 1940s. So the Ypsilanti roots about food ownership and entrepreneurship lives today when you look at the Thompson and Company restaurant, which is located right on North River Street. Executive chef Keith Martin, he and his co-owner John Carlson discussed basing their menu on Southern American cuisine. Chef Martin's older generation of his family are from the South. He's been cooking Southern food all of his life, which reflected in the deliciousness of the food. But even in Ann Arbor, recently we had Beverly Gaza. She had owned prepared Caribbean food right at the corner of Packard and Woodlawn. And in the 70s, George Thomas, 84-year-old baker, who had a regular stand at the farmer's market. He sold lots of things, bread, peach and apple turnovers, sweet potato pies. He became a professional baker at the age of 80 after working many years on the railroad. Ann Arbor also was home to Mr. Rib owner, Jesse Campbell, who had his own specialty sold on a roll. And when it comes down to Ann Arbor barbecue, probably the king and the queen of that business would be Robert and Adeline Thompson, who founded and operated DeLong's Barbecue for 38 years. His daughter recalled in conversations that whenever he cooked out in the summertime, any barbecues in the backyard, people would just drift in. Oh man, this smells so good, because you could smell it everywhere. He had a really good friend from Detroit who said, you know, you need to try this and start a business. So at that time, he went to the Ann Arbor Bank, couldn't get a nickel from them. And he knew it was because he was Black. He went to another bank. They said no. But his friend in Detroit had several businesses. He found a way. He loaned him the money to get started. And he started that business on Detroit Street on the side of a gas station. And at the time, the gas station was owned by an older white lady. She wanted to sell it. Many times, Robert went to her to ask her about buying the building. And she said, you know what, I'll tell you what. You get it started on the side, not part of the gas station. You can sell it out of the window. He was truly a food entrepreneur. He devised the cooking mechanism. His wife made all the sides and all the stuff. She made everything, the potato salad, the cakes, the pies. They made the sauce. They did everything themselves. It got so big and so busy that the lady who owned it knew it was going to be worthwhile for her to sell the business to him. He got the building. But because it was a gas station, he had to remediate the property. Remove the gas tanks. They had to do a lot of renovations, but they did that. He opened in 1964. The beautiful thing about DeLong's on Detroit Street, it was important to our community. There were people who would be going to the Elks Pratt Lodge up on Sunset, and when that would close, people would get right on over to DeLong's because they would go straight there. The line would sometimes be wrapped around the block. It was hard for them to keep up. And once he got that building together, he was able to hire cooks, start delivering. It just took off. Everybody didn't want to drive to Detroit to get ribs. And at the time, DeLong's was the only place where you could get it. The food was a hit, the sauce was a hit, and then he decided to really do some more innovation. Let's put some sauce on those fries. I came here eating ketchup on my French fries from the East Coast. I left here eating nothing but that sauce on my fries. Then they added trout, dinners, sandwiches, shrimp by the pound, anything you wanted, full and half slabs of ribs, chicken boxes, carry out. They were in business for 38 years. Changing health in the family brought all those changes and transformations. The building was torn down this year for $1 million condos. It definitely leaves a hole in the community that is real. But people who lived here in the 40s and the 50s remember visiting Ann Street, North 4th Avenue for food, entertainment, and communities. And one of those fixtures was Midway Lunch, a restaurant run by David and Moselle Keaton at 111 East Ann. And there were others. Noah B. Fort ran a restaurant in 1915. James A. Moore ran a restaurant at 209 4th Avenue for more than 12 years. Clara had a dining room. Josephine and Julia operated tea rooms at 211 North 4th Avenue. And the Bon Ton Grill, 121 East Ann, proudly served by Marion Presley. So we can look back historically, we can see that the African American community has been vibrant, thriving, feeding families, feeding each other. Today, we have the Blue Nile. That restaurant opened in 1989. Married couple from Ethiopia served the most delicious food from their homeland. Cuppy's Best Soul Food Bistro has been in business since 2010. Andrea White, very good friend of mine. Her food is cooked from the soul and from the heart. And the the name comes from her childhood. She was so small when she was born as a baby. Her grandfather nicknamed her Cuppy because he thought she was small enough to fit in the cup of his hands. But the macaroni and cheese, candied yam, baked beans, and collard greens, some of the restaurant's top sellers. They also have a version of soul on a roll, vegetarian and meat, paying attention to all the favorites of their customers. And you certainly can't leave out what's in your cup. Amazing plant-based vegan restaurant offering smoothies, juices, wraps, and salads, fresh squeezed juices, organic foods. And then I'll bring it full circle to true homestyle cook and Victor Swanson, who learned how to cook alongside of his grandmother, Lou Ellis Swanson, who owned Swanson's Cafe on Harriet Street in Ypsilanti's historic South Side. I met the granddaughters, the Swan girls, who talked about the Swan burgers just this year when we had an intergenerational exhibit at the African American Museum on Pontiac Trail. And part of that exhibit, we had stories of people who migrated from the South during the Great Migration and talked about how important food was in their culture, in their family, in their security. And the common thread is that food heals, it nurtures, it supports us, it loves us. And it's what we give to each other to create the communities that we have. So our history is so rich in this area with foodways and African American farmers, growers, preparers. Our history is not defined by those who want to tell it. So my experience in history with the community is we find that we serve as a gathering place, a resource. Everybody has a short story to share. And when given that space to contribute, the ingredients that enrich our community is just what makes this the type of place that we want it to be, which is better than it is and more than it can be right now.
We just got to let that breathe for just a second. I told you and Adrian yesterday that there is always a moment for me in this broadcasts, where I am so absolutely clear that our ancestors have conspired for the moment to happen, and listening to your voices. I feel it in my body more. My brain can't even fully process all of what you've said. I'm like you, Bev, I'm a transplant to this community, but I came from Detroit, America's largest Black city, right? I came to Washtenaw County in the very late, in the top of the 1990s. And I was friends with Jesse Campbell's kids, right? And it became that kinship and that relationship steadied my transition to a very different community culturally. And so when I was thinking about the New Center transformation, it was sparked by you and Shirley Beckley and Tisha Montague, who's on this call, and folks like, I don't know, shout out to Malik, who has actually cut, I think, 3 heads while we had this episode. We love you, brother, and we see you. But Malik that was somebody I went to high school with. We were at Huron High School when it had its first Black principal, Dr. Joetta Mile, whose husband was also the first Black president of Jones Northside Elementary School, and had been a teacher at Jones Elementary School, which is now Community High. And while Jones had been predominantly Black, Community is now the whitest and wealthiest school, located right there in Carytown and across from where DeMongs was. So when I'm talking about the New Center transformation, what I'm talking about is my responsibility to contribute to the revisibilization of the stories that belong to that neighborhood. That when my mom drove us down North Main, and my first professional job was up further from the New Center on Main Street. But when my mom drove down North Main into downtown, she pointed at, honey, the houses that are across the street from this railroad station are all owned by Black folks. And what is the old West Side, since renamed Water Hill, those were the homes and houses that we went into, right? And people would say, I remember this guy, Kai, his grandmother owned that house at the bottom of Summit and Beats, right? That has since been redeveloped. Speaking of Shirley Beckley, who keeps my feet to the fire about telling the histories of our neighborhood, it was her who told me that the water, the Huron River that runs alongside News Building, that before the dam was put in, it was a segregated Black beach that Black folks, and this is, Shirley's 80, so this is within, the last 60 years, right? That right where I parked my car, she had to put her Black body. She couldn't go to Argo Park. And so when these stories are so important, I mentioned Tisha, who's building on the generation of Lucille Porter, who started the African American Festival so that we would, in the 90s, so that we wouldn't forget the importance of Ann Street and 4th Ave and Catherine, where now we're involved in a affordable housing project, right, at the corner of Catherine and 4th Ave. But Lucille didn't want us to forget that history of Black economic power building that now Tisha, under her leadership, and others are building on. So I did drop a couple resources, including, I really appreciate that earlier this month, Ari, who's at Zingerman's, and Zingerman's is on Detroit Street, right? That's their first place, is on Detroit Street, that Ari really talks about, as we should be, how the contributions of Black folks into that area contributed to the success that we now know of. And that success is massive when you think about the 9 businesses that Zingerman's now owns. And I and you and Tisha are involved not just in the Catherine Street affordable housing development that Avalon Housing is building, but we've been involved in Black Washtenaw Collaboratory, which is researching the history of Black segregation in this community with an effort to uplift a counter narrative about what Washtenaw County was like, even as a up north city. In many ways, it had very Southern practices, even if they weren't inculcated or locked in by law. So thank you for that. Super important. And there's so much more history. I wanted to, and thank you to Tisha and Malik and other, Lori Saginaw I see is on. These are all people who have ties to this rich and dynamic history that we're talking about. Also on this Zoom is Julius Buzzer, who is the executive director of Growing Hope. And they're talking a lot about food sovereignty in this community and building on the history of, for example, the Arrays who owned farmland south of Ann Arbor and the folks out in Chelsea. So much like rich representation even here. Let me pause though, Hamida, because I do think there was somebody who had a question. We got a little bit of time.
Absolutely. So Dwight Turner dropped in here, and I think it's interesting. Our food is global and no culture isn't attached to it, but how is that different from hip hop, clothing, speech, or anything else? Smells like the same flavor of appropriation to me. And I think that's a really important question to raise around what is appropriation, what is appreciation, what are all the things in between? Adrian, Bev, any thoughts? Does that evoke any thoughts for you?
Yeah, I think it's part of human nature to borrow when encountering new stuff. So I think we've been doing a mixtape throughout human history. So what I tell people is, if you get something from another culture, acknowledge the source, do it well, because nobody wants a nasty version of some other culture's food. And if you are in a position where you can compensate the person who gave you that idea, do so. But those are the guideposts for me, because I think when you start delving this history, especially because so much of it is not documented, it's really hard to just say this culture started this, completely. It's just really hard to do that. So usually there are influences at play. So I think it's about recognition, doing something well, and then compensation if you can do that. There was some famous cases recently where people would go to some place, they would observe a creative person, an artisan, however you want to describe it, doing their craft, and then they would go back to their country and start doing it. And that they didn't get permission to do that and are not compensating those people. Those are the folks that really get in trouble. Mm-hmm. So those are kind of my guidelines with that.
I think my guidelines with that are claim it. If our root is yams and cayenne pepper, say it. So when it is used or taken or misappropriated or whatever, the root is clear. But claiming doesn't mean total ownership. I also believe that I've just learned this from local history. A lot of times in history work, we think we have to interpret. That's part of the definition. Museums interpret history. Historians interpret events. Our times are a little different. I've learned that my role as a historian is really to listen and to document and to preserve. I've learned so much from Shirley Beckley in terms of doing local history. And every time we sit down to try to scan a stack of photos, we don't get beyond 2, because the stories that come with those photos are far more beautiful and important and interesting for me to be present for. So I've learned that the projects that we envision require not just the 2 of us, but a team of people who can scan and listen at the same time and generate the results that we need to get to the end. And that means the river has to be wide and the stream becomes a river. And there's many people who are part of that and play a role in it. When you get your end product and you can turn it over without having to have your name on it, but knowing that the work is really well done and beautifully inclusive, it speaks for everybody who participated. That's sort of, I think, what the goal is of ours in this time. We're just stewards, caretakers. It passes through our hands. So I just want to do the best work in that And I've learned that that means slowing down on what I think should be, but making sure that I capture. And that includes making sure you hit the save button on any recordings you do on your phone. Because if you don't do that, that conversation is not very well preserved. Usually have one experience like that that trains you to hit the save button. But I feel like it's a real community work, and the more people that can be involved and inspired by it, the greater reach it has and the much more beautiful longevity it can carry.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, Bev. Just real quickly, in my early days of talking to people about soul food, reaching out to chefs and others, again, because of the stigma and other things, and I think unfair context that soul food's often put into, people distance themselves from this food. Like I had very accomplished chefs say, "Don't talk about soul food or connect me to soul food," okay? And I just that hurt my heart, and I just said to them, "Okay, why not?" And then also, have you ever heard a famous French chef say, "Don't associate me with rustic French cooking"?
Mhm.
No, it's in their wheelhouse. It's part of their repertoire, and then they go cook whatever they want. But they know that's part of their heritage. And I just would hope that more African American cooks, chefs would just understand this is part of our heritage. Go cook whatever you want, but embrace and celebrate what's ours.
Thank you for that. Don't feel like you have to speak quickly, though. If you have something
Oh,
else on your heart, we have a few more minutes.
okay. No, I'm good.
But you do, I was just telling Carly and Hamida as we think about, and y'all always help us to think about the show content. But one of the things that feels really important to me to talk about this year is grief. And one, I mean, aside from how we might typically think about grief, death, dying, loss, things of that nature, many of, well, I'll use an I statement. I am actively grieving the reality of the narratives and truths I swallowed about me from some external perspective versus what I know to be true, what my people said was true about me, right? As you get older and you get more fortified in who you are and what the significance of your life is. And so part of how we control people is through story, is to tell them who they are, to tell them what matters, to tell us what is valuable and what is not, what's good and what isn't. And that really, that is the toxic conditioning of supremacy in all its forms, but particularly white supremacy. It was particularly in anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous, trafficking, invisibilization, erasure. It was about disconnecting us from the truth of who we were. Because if we knew, right, if we fully knew, I don't mean that we don't already, but if we fully knew, we, not only would we be powerful and more powerful, but we'd be dangerous, right? And so I love that you said in moving through these shared narratives that it's important for us to honor those for whom have inspired us by tithing to them, by resourcing them. It's important for us to ask deep questions, right? What else is true here? Because as you know, Adrian, so much of cultural traditions were passed orally. And so we have to interrogate the written histories that we've been fed. And then to hold nuance, something I'm getting more comfortable with, but that even for those of us, even for Black folks, right, we as part of our own liberation and freedom work, have to make room for multiple truths to exist, right? And for the monolithic nature and the multiplicity in the identity of Blackness, right? Be it blurred or be it soul food chef or be it French chef. And to know that our ancestors embodied all of those identities the way we do today, even though the stories have been pretty narrow about who we are. And then Hamida, what you offered, that we are as a global majority interconnected, and we do have these periods of time where our traditions have been co-opted, sometimes made better, oftentimes not, sometimes, re-owned or reshaped by somebody else. And then the piece that I put in the comments that I hope we'll all grapple with is this idea of ownership, as you said at the top, Hamida, of mindness, right? And it is a practice, at least when I think about land and I think about things we own, it is something that we learned from the colonizers, from the ruling class elite who used ownership as a way to lay claim to these things, these cultures, these norms, these places that we share together. And so here we are, migratory people, whether forced or intentional. We are a migratory people in the overlaps of our food and our ingredients. We are not a melting pot, but a collision of many ancient, rich cultures, from West Africans to West Caribbean Indians to Asian folk and beyond. And here, continuing to illuminate forgotten recipes, which you both did for us today. And we're deeply grateful, deeply grateful. What you got, Hamida, Carly?
I heard the name Carly and I want to pause because Carly, not to put pressure, but if there are some thoughts that come up for you, I would be overjoyed to hear it.
Yeah, I'm thinking just a couple of different things. I mean, one, this conversation has been so impactful, and I really appreciate what y'all have been putting in the chat throughout the last hour and a half. And we'd also just love to hear your feedback on the episode. And so we do have a survey link that we can drop for you all. Thanks, Hamida, for popping that in the chat. Please just keep us posted on like what really resonated for you today in this episode. What do you want more of? We'll follow up with a great email that captures the recording, so you can, Alexis, I saw you were in your office having a good time. Maybe you could share that with your colleagues, and we'll also include a bunch of links and resources for you as well. So that's what's really on my mind, Hamida, as well as coming back for future episodes. It's going to be a great year ahead. I can already tell with the theme of story and narrative that we've really started today.
Thanks so much for that, Carly. I think one thing came up, and, Dwight, I really appreciated your question. And I think Yodit and I have been rumbling with a piece of what does it mean to process through a topic, a concept, and not land at the same place and still hold love for each other. And on a relational level, also hold that there can be multiple narratives and perspectives. And you might notice that some of us fell in different places today on CJ. That's also something that we're trying to live into and thinking about when we talk about diverse perspectives and identities and experiences. That might mean that one day I might feel away and Yodit might feel away, and we might have to talk it through, or you might have to do that with a friend or a colleague or a family member. So my hope is that we really spend time in CJ thinking about how we can deepen understandings and think about how we want to behave and act and move with each other. Thanks for joining us today, y'all. Thank you so much, Adrian. Thank you, Bev.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Y'all hang on for some music. And Dwight, if you want to stick on to talk more, let's do it.
Here we go, we here to grow, let them know, we send a justice, yeah, we send a justice. You don't need much to give with abundance. I believe, true indeed, we plant to seed, yeah. We send a justice, yeah, we send a justice to give the youth a chance to live with substance. Yeah, here we go, we here to grow, we let them know, we send a justice, yeah, we send a justice. You don't need much to give with abundance. I believe, we believe, true indeed, we plant to seed, yeah.
Thank you all. Does anyone have any questions or anything that they wanted to chat about before we hop off the call?
No. Thank you guys so much.
Yeah, it was fun. Thank you.
It was fun. Appreciate it.
Thank you both.
You are
Carly,
so
please
welcome.
stop recording and then